On This Week in Enterprise Tech, Microsoft saves the internet right before breaking it. You can't run an Indiegogo campaign without a note from your nanny state, and AlienVault is here to show you how contextual security should work. Quiet on the set.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for This Week in Enterprise Tech is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Twit. This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 98, recorded July 7th, 2014. Contextual Security from AlienVault. This Week in Enterprise Tech is brought to you by Prosper. Prosper is a peer-to-peer lending marketplace which connects people who are looking to borrow money with those who have money to lend. Visit prosper.com/twit and receive a $50 Visa prepaid card when you get a loan. And by TechServe, the world's largest independent Apple retailer and professional services provider. Go to techserve.com/twit-7sins to get access to the free ebook on the 7 deadly sins of iPad deployment. Welcome to Twit, This Week in Enterprise Tech. It's the show dedicated to the enterprise professional, the IT pro, and the geek who just wants to know how the world is connected. I'm your host, Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit, your guide to all things in the enterprise. And of course, I've brought my friends, starting with Mr. Brian Chee, the director of the Advanced Network Computing Laboratory in Honolulu, Hawaii. Brian, it's so good to have you back after your vacation in, where was it, the sun?
Yeah. We were at Vegas at the American Library Association meeting. Kathy was doing her conference thing, and I was hiding in the hotel room trying to stay out of the triple-digit baking. But I also was playing with a little bit of Arduino goodness, and I'm hoping to be able to open source a bunch of power monitoring systems. That ought to be really nice.
Nice. Just goes to show you can't take the geek away from the geek toys. Speaking of geek toys, we've got Mr. Curtis Franklin from Information Week, who showers us with geek toys each and every single week from his radio show. Curtis, good to have you back. You weren't in Las Vegas. Where were you?
Padre, I was not in Las Vegas. I was over on the west coast of Florida, enjoying the balmy waters of the Gulf of Mexico, getting this deep, dark tan that you see here, and just getting re-energized to come back and be with the Twit Riot for another great episode.
Yeah, I almost didn't recognize you with that tan. I mean, you look, that's like, but you're like my skin color now. Strange. Yeah. You know what, folks? Let's get away from tans and go straight into the news blips. This one is for the nostalgia. You know, you've got a 10 gigabit Ethernet network if you are at the top of your IT field. And oh, I remember that. That was so cute back when we had 10 gigabit, because that's all gone now. If all goes as planned, your 10 gigabit Ethernet network is about to get bit slapped by a consortium of 5 network powerhouses. Microsoft, Google, Arista, Mellanox, and Broadcom have teamed up to push a spec for 25 and 50 gigabit Ethernet connectivity to be released within the next 12 to 18 months. The spec is an Ethernet-based protocol designed for transmission between NICs and top-of-the-rack switches, ideal for data centers who want to be ready for 100 gig backbone uplinks. The protocol allows for 25 gigabit single lane and 50 gigabit dual lane connectivity and will be offered royalty-free.
Well, I'm going to go a little bit into international travel, and this comes to us from The Verge and NBC News. Make sure you charge your mobile devices before you do international travel. Apparently, international travelers will have to make sure they charge all their devices before they board their flights. In an announcement made last Sunday, the TSA now plans on blocking flyers with uncharged phones and electronic devices at certain undisclosed airports in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. In addition to other forms of screening, passengers will need to prove their devices can actually turn on before flying. According to NBC News, the new security measures are being made in an effort to stop Al-Qaeda terror plot blamed at blowing up an airliner. Bummer. Officials are reportedly concerned that a laptop, smartphone, or tablet might be used as a bomb. Passengers' shoes will also be scrutinized at checkpoints. It's observed that the new measures will prove more effective than the agency's screening of passengers by observation techniques called SPOT, which after a General Accounting Office study was found to perform the same or slightly better than chance.
Now, Intel wants it to be open source all the way down. Intel loves big data, it cannot lie, and it wants you to love big data too, as long as you're looking for analytical love on an Intel processor. Toward that end, Intel has started working with the Cloudera distribution of Hadoop to build a version of the big data distributed database that takes special advantage of features found in Intel CPUs. It's a first step towards creating a complete open source analytical environment with everything from the operating system to the analytics applications running on systems featuring Intel processors. Now, all of this is coming just in time for companies that are beginning to ask serious questions about what they're going to do with all the data coming from the Internet of Things, an embedded internet that is giving hope to a number of processor foundries not owned by Intel. Now, whether you question their motives or not, it looks like Intel has a serious interest in making it much easier and cheaper to develop top-notch analytics on a foundation of Hadoop.
Yo, dog. I heard you like Tor, so oh, forget it. Let the Black Hat madness begin. Alexander Vyenkin and Michael McCord will be presenting at a talk entitled, "You Don't Have to Be the NSA to Break Tor, De-anonymizing Users on a Budget." As the title might suggest, the duo plan to show how Tor can be broken using, quote-unquote, a handful of powerful servers and a couple of gigabit links, all for less than $3,000. However, looking at the description of the talk, the Tor community may not yet need to run screaming for the hills. The demonstration will cover, and again I quote, the nature, feasibility, and limitations of possible attacks, and then dive into a dozen of successful real-world de-anonymization case studies. So it may be more of a technical mind gymnastics than a zero-day exploit. Well, when we come back, we're going to be jumping right into our Enterprise Bytes, talking a little bit about how Microsoft bungled a large part of the internet. But before that, let's talk about the first sponsor of the show. That's right, folks. It's Prosper. What if you knew that in 72 hours you could have $35,000 to cover your needs? Well, what would you do with it? Would you pay off your high-rate credit cards? Would you start a business? Would you finally do that home improvement that you've been putting off year after year? Well, what if I told you that by filling out an easy online application and providing a few details, you could see a rate online instantly without ever stepping foot in a bank? Well, that's not fantasy. That's Prosper. Prosper offers low fixed rates, unsecured personal loans, which means no collateral required, and has multi-year terms available. I remember a long time ago when my computer consultation for a company grew past my resources. I needed cash, which meant that I needed a loan from a bank. And that process was as demeaning as it was confusing, showing one bank manager after another that my business wasn't just cash positive, but profit flush, with a need for just enough cash to fulfill my existing contracts. I wish Prosper had existed back then. Then I could have saved myself the wear and the tear and the degradation of the bank shuffle and gotten the cash I needed immediately from someone who believed in my project. Prosper is an innovative peer-to-peer lending process, Silicon Valley's answer to a more modern, community-based personal loan. There are no outrageous fees, no raising interest rates, and yes, you'll never set foot in a bank. Prosper has more than 2 million members, lenders and borrowers, over $1 million in funded loans, $1 billion in funded loans. Folks, this is peer-to-peer lending. Prosper connects the people who need money with those who have it to loan. It's that simple. It's baffling that this isn't the way that we all do business. Prosper connects people who need money, again, with those who have it to loan, so you should be part of the Prosper movement. Just go to prosper.com/twit to check your rate instantly without affecting your credit score. Now, here's what we want to do. For a limited time, Prosper is offering Twit viewers a $50 Visa prepaid card. Then you get a loan. Go to prosper.com/twit. That's a special site just for our viewers. Up to $35,000 in just 3 days and a $50 Visa prepaid card. Go to prosper.com/twit. That's prosper.com/twit. And we thank Prosper for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Now, boys, let's get right to it. The first story is all about Microsoft taking IPs away from a domain registrar in order to safeguard the internet, and then screwing it up. Last week, Microsoft convinced a judge to turn over a chunk of IP addresses from dynamic domain hosting service NoIP.com. Within those IP addresses were hosted domains that had allegedly been used by Mohammed Ben Abdallah, who believed to be living in Algeria, and Nasser al-Mutari, believed to be living in Kuwait. The two have a rep for being black hat hackers who were using their domains as malware vectors. Now, Microsoft claimed that NoIP, the company that was dynamically hosting those domains, was not doing enough to stop the criminals, so they convinced a judge to turn those IPs and those domains over to Microsoft. Now, Microsoft said, well, we're going to put this into Azure, and our security will be more than enough to block the malware domains, and all of the customers will be happy. So they did it. A federal judge turned it over to them. They were able to take the IP range. They were able to take the domains, and everyone lived happily ever after. No, I'm just kidding. It was a complete mess-up disaster. After Microsoft took control of NoIP, well, that chunk of the internet died. Azure wasn't able to handle the load of so many dynamically assigned domains and services, and all those services became unavailable for almost half of NoIP's 14 million customers. Just a few days later, Microsoft cried uncle and returned control of the IP space and domains to NoIP. Cheever, let me throw this over to you first. We always hear about how Azure as a cloud service is expandable, it's scalable, it can handle pretty much any load because it's so well balanced. Why did it crumble underneath the load of NoIP?
You know, without peeking under the hood, I'm not sure, but I suspect Microsoft likes eating their own dog food, and the DNS clusters may not have been up to it. We have seen that at a couple of Microsoft trade shows where the DNS has tipped over and had to be reset. There is something to be said about people that are running systems that are fine-tuned to handle DNS. And we know that some people, we happen to use Dyn at Interop, are able to handle massive, massive loads. And I'm just not sure that Microsoft knows how to do that yet. They've been doing it for Azure, but they've never really done it for massive, massive amounts of DNS-only traffic, which makes a pretty big difference.
Right, yeah. I think their setup is to ensure services remain online, but they're not expecting so many DNS queries off of a small amount of IP addresses, which is what NoIP does. It's a dynamic domain assignment company. In other words, they can take a pocket of IPs and share it among millions because not every single domain gets its own IP address. I want to throw this over to you, Curtis. Here's something that's bigger than just the NoIP debacle, and that is, who's responsible for attacks that are launched from a particular piece of infrastructure? In other words, if I am a system administrator, if I run a corporation, and it turns out that someone was attacking server X from the IPs and the network that's under my control, is it my responsibility to quash that? And is it my legal responsibility to cover damages?
Well, let me preface my answer to that by saying that I am not a lawyer. I do not play one on Twyat, but I think the answer is going to depend heavily on which jurisdiction you're in, and that's both one of the blessings and one of the problems with the internet. It runs across so doggone many domains, not just network domains, but political domains. It runs through every country, each of which has its own laws about how things are handled. And cross-jurisdictional issues are huge. Now, that's how I suspect Microsoft was able to convince a judge that they needed this, because the U.S. has been very expansive in its view of what jurisdictions mean and where the U.S.'s legal jurisdiction extends to. Basically, if it is within the reach of the internet, it's part of our jurisdiction, is the way it all boils down. To me, the interesting thing is that Microsoft was able to do something that I suspect we're going to see a lot more of. They're claiming that the issue is security, and they were able to convince a judge to grant them extraordinary powers. In the past decade and a half, we have become a place where crying security opens all kinds of doors, even if the people who are doing the crying aren't really ready for what lies behind those doors. And that was the case here. Brian and I have seen in many, many, many reviews that there's a huge difference in bandwidth and connections A router, a security box that can handle tons of bandwidth can roll over and die with too many simultaneous connections. That's the sort of problem that Microsoft was running into, as Brian referred to. You've got to be prepared for success. Microsoft wasn't, and the result was a huge headache for lots and lots of legitimate customers. This won't be the last time this happens.
I like what Web 2057 is saying in the chat room, and that's, well, I mean, they stopped the spammers, didn't they? Well, yeah, they did, because all the services went down. But Chee, I want to throw back to you something that Curtis said, which is we are seeing more and more companies using this idea of security as that's their override, that's their trump card. In fact, we talked about this on Twit yesterday with Goldman Sachs. I'm sorry, yes, it was Goldman Sachs getting Google to freeze an email because they claimed that they accidentally sent it to the wrong address and that email posed a huge security breach to customers, to their database, to the security of everyone who does business with them, even though we know for a fact that it was just a report about regulatory compliance. It seems as if all the company has to do now, Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, Microsoft, Apple's done this, is say, oh, no, this is a security thing. We need emergency powers. And suddenly a judge is willing to turn it over to them. Is this the future of security?
You know, I would hope not, but I have seen it time and time again. Maybe not with a judge involved, but in academics where a faculty member has accidentally sent out private information to an entire class that shouldn't have been sent out, and that's a clear-cut FERPA violation. The IT groups at those universities have basically said, hey, this is a FERPA violation. We're going to just stop the email server temporarily. We're going to go retrieve that email, going to clean it up so that we don't have to pay fines. So I hope it's not going to happen, but I know darn well it's going to happen. And we shall see.
Yeah, I mean, the big problem here is it's not as if Microsoft was reaching down to a company that they don't compete with and saying, let us help you out here. They were reaching out to a company that's a competitor. And competitors shouldn't be able to reach into the pockets of other competitors and say, let me take your really, really valuable IP addresses and domains and customers, and I'll safeguard them for you. I mean, there's something that sounds wrong. Now, let me be clear. I believe that this was done with good intent. I believe that you had some Microsoft engineers who thought they had a really simple technical solution for making this work. I just think it was very ham-fisted and very what do you call it? Unlegally believable. What do you think, Curtis?
Well, I think we come back to the idea that you had people who thought they were doing something simple, and I'll go along with you. Let's ascribe nothing but the best and purest of motives to Microsoft and its employees in all of this. But they didn't have a clear understanding of the business they were taking over. They knew their business. They decided that their business was close enough to the business they were taking over that it wouldn't matter. You know, one of the things that we found out in discussing all of the things around network virtualization and software-defined networks is that as you get big, it gets enormously complex. And the expertise required to do a specific thing very well at very high levels of performance and very reliably are not evenly distributed across the technology landscape. Microsoft thought that it was a big enough company to have someone who was an expert in absolutely everything. That may be, but they weren't able to put the person with the expertise in large-scale dynamic IP or dynamic DNS to bear on this problem. It caused huge issues. And like I said, I have to believe that this is not the last time we'll have the opportunity to talk about something very similar to this.
Yeah. I think in the meantime, what we can gather from this is we've decided that Discovery Channel is actually a security flaw. It's a very open vector for attack, so we're now going to appeal to a federal judge that take over their programming just to safeguard, make sure that the internet stays safe. Let's go on to the next story before I get into more legal trouble. PayPal freezes Indiegogo campaign funds because they think that encrypted email needs government permission. Yeah, that's right. That's not a misquote. That's actually what happened. Proton Mail is a Swiss crowd-funded startup that is developing a web-based cross-platform, browser-side JavaScript email client with end-to-end encryption. Now, the system uses 2 passwords. The first is to verify who you are so that Proton Mail can load up the correct profile. But the second password is the encryption password for the session. In other words, even if you have the profile, unless you have the encryption password, you can't access anything in the account, which also means that Proton Mail can't reset your account. That's the level of security. In other words, you are the only one that holds the keys. If you lose those keys, you're done. It's an inconvenience, but it's also a crazy amount of security. Now, because the session itself is encrypted, Proton Mail has no access to the data, so they are selling the service as the most secure email service on the planet. However, it seems that they've run afoul of some people over at PayPal. Now, we know that PayPal has to deal with scams all the time, so they have a pretty big consumer protection department. But last week, PayPal informed Proton Mail that their account for their Indigogo campaign had been restricted pending further review. So, of course, Proton Mail rapidly tried to figure out why their account was restricted, figure out what rules they had run afoul of, and the PayPal representative finally, when pushed, said, well, we don't know if Proton Mail is legal, and we'd like to know if you have the government's permission to encrypt email. Okay, so let's start with that. Curtis, that's perfectly normal, right? I mean, you do need government permission to encrypt anything.
Oh, absolutely. I think that anytime you encrypt anything at all, even your personal information on your own thumb drive, you really need to get permission from the government to do it. Not.
Exactly.
No, the only way that there could be a legitimate concern here is if somehow this was a U.S.-based company that was looking at exporting certain high-level encryption to specific nations. And since it was a Swiss company, not doing, as far as I know, they don't have a business nexus here in the U.S. It's not an issue at all for PayPal. I suspect this is yet another case of someone worrying that the men in black will come knocking at their door if they somehow facilitate this kind of stuff, and it's a shame.
All right. Chee, we covered this story on Security Now last week, and there were a lot of people in the chat room who, half-jokingly were saying, well, they probably got a tap on the shoulder from the government, and so the government doesn't have to step in, but PayPal can take the hit. But the fact that the account was almost immediately reopened, they were given control of their funds, tells me that this was just an oops. It was just a blunder. It was an honest mistake from an employee who was a little bit too overzealous and looking for scams and frauds. But it opens up a bigger concern for me, which is the chilling effect of all the security revelations that have made it out in the last year and a half or so. Companies are now paranoid about potentially doing something that could have the NSA breathing down their neck, and now they're erring on the side of ripping up the Constitution, because this is completely against the Fourth Amendment. We already know that. I'm not going to run over the arguments again. Just talk about the right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Cheever, this is something that if you run a company, you have to be worried about, right? I mean, you don't want to be seen to be compliant with someone who is scamming or doing something that could be deemed terrorist activity. Well,
the section in Sarbanes-Oxley that I've been able to review doesn't really say that. It just has to be, it's all about due diligence. So yeah, maybe they're getting a little bit too crazy and too nervous about this. But the reality is, taking a sidestep, this exact process has been done forever and ever with Microsoft Exchange. It's not really new technology. What's new about it is it's in a public email service. It's been done forever in private. So what makes it so different? If this is something that someone's so nervous about, what's going to happen when Office 365 starts offering Exchange services as part of it? Because then you have an encrypted link into the session, same as Proton Mail, and you have an encrypted logins using TLS, same as Proton Mail. So what's going to happen to Office 365? This is a bad precedent. I wish it never happened. But yeah, I do agree that it's probably someone really, really nervous and really worried about someone going and say, hey, we're going to open your books because we think you're supporting terrorists.
Yeah, and that I think was one of the scariest parts from the enterprise view of the way that the NSA even now has been cleared to operate, and that is if they can look at you if they start making connections. Well, one of those connections can be, well, are you materially supporting someone who is a target of interest? Well, no one wants to become connected to a target of interest, so of course you've got people and companies that are going to err on the side of paranoia. Let's go to the last story before we bring in our guest, and that is, guess what? We figured out what was going to kill the internet. We have a Pew Research Internet Project report that interviewed just dozens, thousands, hundreds of thousands of internet folk around the world, experts in their fields, about the biggest threats to the internet, and they came up with 4. The first is the balkanization of the internet by nation states who use blocking, filtering, and segmentation to maintain security and political control. The second is people who stop turning to the internet for information as they lose trust in the veracity in the wake of government/corporate surveillance. 3 is commercial pressure. We also know that is the death of net neutrality. And 4, efforts to fix TMI, like, for example, the right to be forgotten in the EU, and the chilling effect it will have on content sharing. Now, I want to open this up to both of you. Maybe you first, Curtis. This is a nice little list, and as far as I can tell, they've kind of nailed the 4 biggest concerns, especially number 1, the balkanization of the internet, that we as IT professionals should have.
Oh, without question. These are 4 very good threats, and I'm looking at them now. You know, to me, one of the interesting things is that if you look at this, it's sort of evenly divided between threats and issues that come from governments and threats that come from corporations. There's not a heavy preponderance of one or the other. The other thing that I think is very interesting is that it deals so heavily with control of our information as individuals. We are suddenly seeing lots and lots and lots of internet users, consumers, who now, some 20 years, give or take, after the internet became part of a lot of folks' daily lives, are beginning to wonder what's happening to all the information that they've been freely putting out there. It's a lot of things coming together, but as I said, to me, the most interesting thing is that it's not just commercial issues that were worrying people, not just government spying, but an even mix of both.
Chee, what about that? I mean, what concerns you the most? If you were to look down that list, what's the scenario that you think we're closest to?
Actually, I think the scenario we're most close to is George Orwell's 1984. When you start getting people with, these types of controls, what's to keep them from doing substitutions, doing changes, making changes? Remember, the main character of George Orwell's book, his main job was to modify history to match the current political, atmosphere. And that's the big thing I'm worried about. We've got a lot of people that are making changes. We've got a lot of people that are trusting of the internet. It's to the point where we're seeing, joke commercials about that. Our French model, that's a great commercial. But I'm afraid that, we're going to start getting too much of that. And the internet does have a real problem with someday becoming just a morass of misinformation. And I worry about that.
What I find most interesting is that the bottom 2 concerns, so concerns but not as important as the top 2, are the death of net neutrality and the things like right to be forgotten. That has gotten all the press in the last 6 months. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're most concerned with. That's the thing that we're saying is going to be the knockout blow to the internet as we know it. And yet, those top 2 concerns, even though they're not as glamorous, even though they don't get as much attention, even though they're a bit more difficult to weed out who the good guy and the bad guy is, they have much higher potential to destroy the internet as we know it. If you balkanize the internet, if you make it so unbelievably censored, or if you make it completely untrusted, then the internet as we know it dies. And, you know, of course, we're not going to suggest any solutions here, but this is something that I think every IT person needs to know. Now, when we come back, we're going to be speaking with Jim Hansen, the Senior Director of Product Management from AlienVault, who's going to tell us a little something about securing your IT enterprise. But before that, I thought this might be a good time to talk about the second sponsor of This Week in Enterprise Tech, and of course, that's TechServe. Now, there are a lot of solutions being deployed on iPads today. We see it all over the place. We see it everywhere. It's the thing to do. Businesses keep coming up with creative ways to service their customers, increase productivity among employees, and make more money with the same resources, all by using the iPad. For example, the Institute of Culinary Education equips students, faculty, and chefs with the iPad, empowering them to do away with heavy and unwieldy textbooks and streamlining the learning process. A major cable service provider in the Northeast gave its field technicians, who are the public face of the company, iPads that had been configured to provide better service to customers. And retail companies have enhanced their in-store customer experience by using the iPad, not just as a point-of-sale device, but also as a spot where customers can learn about sales, special offers, and upcoming events. These clients and more have turned to TechServe, the country's largest Apple reseller that sells, supports, and manages the largest iPad deployments in the world to manage their iPad projects. If you're considering adding iPads to your business, why not ensure the project's success with an experienced partner? TechServe assists businesses of all sizes to deploy Apple solutions, as well as solutions from Avid, Adobe, and more throughout the United States. No matter if you've started deploying iPads already or are just getting started, TechServe can help. So here's what we want you to do. Right now, TechServe is offering a complimentary download just for Twiat listeners who are deploying iPads or who are interested in learning more about doing so. Go to techserve.com/Twiat-7sins to get access to the 7 deadly sins of iPad deployment and see the common pitfalls that throw companies for a loop during iPad projects. This complimentary download is available right now just for Twiat listeners at tekserve.com/Twiat-7sins. And we thank TechServe for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. And we welcome to the show Jim Hansen, the Senior Director of Product Management at AlienVault. Jim, thank you very much for coming up.
Thank you, Padre. I appreciate being here.
Now, we need to tell the folks at home, what is this USM, UTM, USM stuff that we always hear about when we talk about security?
Yeah, USM, UFO, Unified Security Management. What Unified Security Management is a grouping of base security technologies that all come together in a single platform for the security practitioner. So if you think about how the typical security practitioner within an organization deals with security, they go off and they spend hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars a year buying all kinds of different security technologies, everything from vulnerability assessment to network IDS, host IDS, file integrity monitoring, ... There's a bunch of other ones there as well. And they bring all those tools in-house. They hire people to look at those tools, to manage those tools, and ultimately to try to get better visibility into the security posture of their environment so they can understand what's happening, identify the threats that are potentially impacting them as an organization or somebody, for example, trying to steal their data, and then they go off and they spend more money updating them and licenses and everything else. Unified Security Management takes all of those basic security capabilities, it brings them together into just a single unified platform, one that a single IT person within a small to medium-sized organization, and when I say small and medium-sized organization, I don't mean organizations that are a popsicle stand or something of that nature. We're talking about organizations that have small security teams, and that can be a small company, a medium company, or in some cases, very large companies that just have very small security functions within there. Bring all of those capabilities together into one single unified contextual view so that you can get better visibility into what's happening throughout the infrastructure without having to go from one tool to the next tool in order to see what's going on.
Let's talk about that contextual tool, because that's something that I think a lot of security vendors and actual security deployments don't take into account strongly enough. there are many tools out there. Some of them are incredibly good at what they do, but the temptation is to buy the best box and then just have it running without an easy way to interpret the data that's coming off of it. What do you think is the best way to create a contextual single pane of glass?
Well, I think it really comes down to how organizations actually function. When you think about the people that are involved in security within any kind of company, they always struggle. Every company that I talk to, on the small side, on the large side, they all struggle with the exact same problem, which is they don't really have a whole heck of a lot of time to sit and deal with all these various tools that are going to give them, quote unquote, different types of visibility. So you'll end up buying some network type tools, you'll buy some host-based tools, and you'll bring all of those tools in-house, you'll hire people to manage them, and ultimately, then you run into situations like Target and other companies that have recently run into these breaches. And the reality is, when you start to take a look at the approach that these organizations are taking, they're buying all these tools, they're securing things at these very specific point locations, and at the end of the day, they're still getting breached. And you have to ask yourself, why are they still getting breached? Well, a couple of reasons. One, the bad guys are getting better at what they're doing. The bad guys also have the ability to be able to change at the drop of a hat. If they get discovered or part of their botnet infrastructures get taken down for whatever reason, they can pretty quickly and easily spin something else up and take ownership over the same degree of systems that they had before. Well, how does that impact the IT practitioner? Well, most everybody focuses heavily and has been focusing heavily for years on preventative controls. So think of those basic security capabilities that are going to prevent access, your firewalls, your IPSs, and so forth. Well, the reality is, and this is something that we see over and over again, putting those basic preventative controls, you have to do it. It's a basic barrier to entry for doing any kind of true security program. But the reality is you still have to get very good at detection and response. And that detection and response component is where that context comes into play. Being able to see, for example, vulnerability data alongside my network IDS, and to be able to identify traffic and information that's happening all together without having to necessarily jump from one tool to the next tool makes it incredibly easier to be able to see what's happening within the environment without necessarily having to go outside to see all kinds of other things.
All right, so let me break in here, because there's going to be people in the chat room. We've got a very, very intelligent chat room who are going to say, okay, I kind of get this, I understand this, but I don't understand what's this paradigm shift that you're trying to introduce to us. What's this new way of thinking that you want us to have? Let's take what I would call a traditional security setup from 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, we were always focused on keeping the bad guys out. That was the paradigm. The paradigm was you have a really good firewall, you have a really good intrusion detection and intrusion prevention system, and you make sure that all of your firewalls are operating in conjunction to make sure that only good guys can get in and only good traffic can get out. That's changed now. I mean, now what we're worried about are things like the advanced, what do you call it? I can't remember what advanced threats, advanced persistent threats, which can live in your network until needed. And it's no longer this idea of keeping your company from getting breached. The idea now is you're going to get breached. How do you deal with it? Where do you think we are along that line? How did we make that switch?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think when you look at everything from mobility to just the fact that here, even in this office here, everyone has a laptop, you have mobile phones, you have a number of paths into your company that are constantly moving around from one place to the other. You're not always being hidden behind the firewall. 10 years ago, how many laptops were there? People had laptops. I had a laptop 10 years ago. But those laptops were generally sitting behind the firewall. So you have a slightly better way of protecting them. The advanced methods that some of the attackers are now using to be able to attack the systems and get access to your data, they've changed as well, right? The bad guys are becoming far more sophisticated, and they're taking advantage of some of the basic security flaws that most organizations fail to bring into the environment. Even simple things like patching, checking for your systems to determine whether they're vulnerable. How many of you who may not necessarily have, for example, some kind of Microsoft SCCM type solution where your systems aren't exactly getting patched, or you click that little button, I'll do that later, I'll do that later, I'll do that later. Well, every time you do that later, what's going to happen is that every time that you then go out to the internet and you happen to go and attach yourself to some web page, something can happen where your laptop basically gets compromised because you've not taken that extra initiative to patch your systems, and the organizations themselves don't necessarily have really strong patching and vulnerability management programs.
All right, Jim, let's break it down even further. If you were to criticize what we might term traditional enterprise security, and you can go far back as you want on this, what would you say are, say, the top three things that you think are done wrong, the top three things that need to be corrected if we're to conform to best practices of enterprise security today? And I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but you're smart, so you can figure it out.
I think it comes down to the basic security controls. From an IT practitioner perspective, you have simple things like figuring out what's on your network, some kind of basic asset discovery capability to be able to understand what's in the environment. Number two, patch management. Patch management is something that, oh goodness, 7 or 8 years ago, I used to be in a company that provided patch management and used to preach to everybody, you must patch your systems. But the reality is, nobody really does it terribly effectively, and nobody is a little bit strong. But and number three, then having good monitoring tools in place. Because at the end of the day, you know you're going to get compromised. This is something that's been proven over and over and over again. So how do you get visibility into the things that are happening? You have to get better at detecting and monitoring for the threats rather than praying that your prevention tools alone are going to save you.
Oh, all right. Now, I want to bring into the conversation Brian Chee, because Cheebert has had a long history with looking at security solutions and figuring out whether or not they actually do what they say they're going to do. Cheebert, you've seen the landscape change over the last 10 years as well, right?
Oh, yeah. Wayne Rash and I did a Internet Week article on security event managers. In fact, we can probably bring up the URL pretty quick. The whole idea sounds very familiar. You know, being able to correlate across multiple systems, no longer trusting the perimeter, but also taking a look at what's going on. In fact, one of the most landmark changes that I saw was being able to correlate physical and internet correlation, you know, event correlation. In fact, one of the examples that Thor Systems did was they showed how they caught a person that was opening a VPN from, say, Europe into the American branch, and also going through a card key swipe. Two things that by themselves shouldn't be a big issue, but together they're a big giant flag. So I saw that a decade ago. You know, how has the industry changed? You know, why did security event managers slowly fall away and become part of operating systems? What makes SIEM different from a decade ago of SEM?
Right, right. Jim, I want to throw a question at you that came to us from the chat room from Max123. I was planning to save this for the demo, but I think it's worthy of a little talk time, and that is, if you're talking about advanced persistent threats, if you're talking about BYOD, people bringing in their laptops and their devices as a vector for infection, a vector for attack, then how would you suggest we protect against that? Is there a technological solution, or is this just IT managers have to do their job and make sure everything is patched?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it comes down to a couple of key things. As I mentioned, you've got these preventative controls, right? You're not going to stop systems from getting compromised. They're going to get compromised at some point. And you know, I kind of look at it two ways. You've got really two types of companies. You've got the companies who have gotten breached and they know about it, and then you've got the companies who just don't know about it. And I think that's really important to understand, because as you take a look at these basic security controls of being able to understand what's happening in the environment, you know, as I was watching the chat, somebody asked even the question, hey, well, gosh, how do you know when somebody's already in what's happening? Well, there's telltale signs, right? As these bad guys get into the environment, they're not silent. They're just not sitting there doing nothing. They have to communicate, and they communicate via well-known paths and through very carefully understood threat intelligence that you can use to apply, again, that context on top of the threats themselves. It gives you a better understanding. And let's remember one thing as well. threats change, right? What is a threat today could change a little bit tomorrow and will change a little bit more the next day. And so how do you stay on top of that? Most organizations aren't really terribly equipped to be able to understand the threat vectors themselves, let alone be able to discern and respond to them as well.
Got it, got it. Now, quick question. What would you say has changed over the last decade from SEM to SIEM? I mean, what have we seen? What technologies have been integrated? How have we changed best practices?
Yeah. So security information and event management, I've been in this field now for about 10 years, and it's interesting to watch it evolve, right? In the early days, security information management, or excuse me, event management was all about correlation. Let me go find a bunch of data. I'm going to bring all of that data into my correlation engine. I'm going to find bad things. I'm going to find a firewall deny followed by an IDS message that's going to give me some information, right? It was really an early false positive clarification mechanism for the SIM space. Now, as things have evolved and you start to incorporate security information management, what you start to see now is a much different approach within the SIM space alone around how you look at information. You see new methods of visualization. You see new approaches to be able to evaluate the information in context with other information. I can take my IDS, which is looking for bad things. I can provide my firewall as context. I can bring in threat data from external threat sources and overlay that so that I can have a better picture of the things that are actually communicating which are bad. And then lastly, as you start to take a look at something like unified security management, for example, unified security management then also bridges together some of those other basic technologies like asset discovery, like vulnerability assessment. So it's not just enough to be able to see that there's some bad activity happening from one system talking to some malicious host on the outside, but rather also being able to take a look at it and see the vulnerabilities associated with those machines, because that's context. That gives you a better understanding as to whether you should care or whether you shouldn't care necessarily about certain types of traffic that are actually taking place.
Wow. Okay, so we're going to be covering asset management. We're going to be covering advanced persistent threats. We're going to be covering external threats, and we're going to be covering internal policy. This should be an interesting demo. I'm going to go ahead and let you get that set up because we're going to be doing a demonstration of AlienVault's product SIEM in just a bit. But before we do that, I'm going to throw over to Curtis. Curtis, this is a talk that I think a lot of IT executives need when they start talking about security, because we've talked about this on the show quite a bit, how they like technological solutions. They like to be able to buy something. They don't really like being told you may have to adjust some of your practices to meet fundamentals. In fact, in the chat room right now, there's a couple of users who keep saying, oh, so we're talking fundamentals. We're always talking fundamentals. And yet, we hear from the executives that they don't understand fundamentals. What's going on?
Well, one of the big issues is that in the grand scheme of things, technology is cheap. No matter how expensive the boxes get, writing that check is easy. Changing one of the other two parts of the triumvirate in security, people, process, technology, is hard and is expensive. And to be brutally honest, the people part of that is the most difficult and the most expensive, because you have to go into training and then you have to train some more. Then you have to keep reminding people of the training they've had. Then you've got to come up with sanctions for those who ignore their training, and then you've got to replace the people who you end up firing because they just didn't get it. That's very expensive and very complicated.
I don't want to do that.
Yeah. It's much easier just to write a check for a box and say we've handled security. It's clean, it's simple. Unfortunately, it's not enough. And that's why we keep having these conversations about security in the enterprise. It's not that our technology isn't keeping up. The technology is quite good. It's the people and the process that 40 years on, we're still working on.
All right, Jim, you've set the bar quite high. Take us through your demo.
All right, thank you. All right, so can they see my screen here? There we go. All right, fantastic. All right, so one of the things that I think it's important to understand as we go through this demo is the approach that we've taken here at AlienVault is pretty simple. Bring everything together, provide that context, give people the contextual updates that they need over time to be able to understand what's happening, and then let them really focus on the things that matter versus trying to deal with everything that may not necessarily matter inside of the environment. Now, what I'm going to show you real quickly as we go through this is the first experience that a user has as they get into our product. And we've designed our product to be very simple and easy to use. And so as part of that, I'm going to walk you through this wizard really quickly, just to give you a sense of what we do as we go through this process. And to keep this in mind, we focus on one key thing as part of our product, results in a day. If you can take the product, install it, get it configured, get it up and running, and get value in that first day, we consider that a success. And that's something that we really focus on heavily as we go through this. So what we're going to do is just walk through that typical process that one would go through in trying to get AlienVault set up and configured within the environment. The first thing that we do as part of that configuration is we want to set up our network IDS. So AlienVault comes built in with a network IDS capability, and that is largely what we use to be able to monitor activity on the wire as things are going from all of the internal environments that you have outside to the outside world. Now, inside of this configuration, we can define very simply network monitoring, and this allows us to be able to set up that mirror and or span or port so that we can bring all of the traffic from our various networks into the system, and we can start monitoring all of that outbound activity. Once we've done that, this basically configures the network monitoring port into promiscuous mode. And it's that simple. We just set it up. And then, of course, the only thing left is to forward your virtual data or your physical data from the physical environment, meaning physical versus your VMware environment or what have you. Bring all of that into the system. And then, of course, the system itself will start looking for different types of threat activity going out over the wire to the internet. Secondly, we also set up log collection and scanning. And like any good security information and event management solution, you do need the ability to bring in external data. You want to bring in your firewall data, your proxy data, your system data, because you want to understand, in addition to what's happening on the actual network, you also want to understand what's happening traffic-wise between the interfaces that you have within the solution. Now, once we finish that, it's pretty simple. We click on Next, and this takes us to our asset discovery. Now, I've taken the liberty of already running this and getting a scan on the network. A scan can take a couple minutes to run. But what we would do is we would come into this environment. We either pre-populate it manually by typing in the assets that we want to go take a look at, or we can simply scan the network. When we scan the network, this is going to allow us to specify the specific networks on the environment that we want to go look at. So in this case, I can go look at my 10/20/30 or my 192/168. We define the CIDRs for those, and we go out and we scan that infrastructure to identify what things are out there. Once we're actually done with that scan, I can repeat it. I can have this thing run once a day, once an hour, or whatever frequency of time that I want. Now, once the assets come back, I can now understand what they are. By default, the asset scan itself will try to discern what kind of device it is. Is this a Windows device? Is it a network device? Is it a Linux device? And from there, once we've identified what these are, we click on Next. And this then takes us to the next really important section, which is deploying out our host-based intrusion detection. When you're looking at the network side of things, is pretty easy. I can take data, I can forward it to the system, but at the same time, we also want to understand what's happening on the actual system itself as well. And using our built-in host-based intrusion detection, which is essentially OSSEC underneath the hood, what this does is it goes out, we put that onto our Windows hosts or our Unix hosts, and then what that does is it starts to bring that information back. It allows us to collect the local data off of those systems. In addition, it allows us to perform very basic tasks like file integrity monitoring, registry monitoring, and so forth, so that we can bring all of that contextual data back as well. And further, it also allows us to be able to look at all the systems and applications and services and so forth that are running. And the reality is, when you're doing a security investigation, which I'll show you in a few minutes, you have to know what's out there. So as part of that investigation, you'll be able to understand what's going on that particular host that might be impacted in some kind of way. The next step is to go through log management. The log management piece is very simple. I can identify what kind of vendor this is. Hey, I can see that this is my host. If for some reason it didn't detect it as part of the asset scan, I can tell them, hey, this is a Cisco ASA device. And of course, we can go down this list, specify all of the different assets that we care about. We enable the log management for those hosts, and now we're collecting data. And that's something that is part of that log management component. You'll be able to now take advantage of that data that's coming in from these data sources pretty easily. Now, the next piece is this join OTX, and this is really important. One of the key differentiators between AlienVault and what you'd see with a typical security information and event management solution is I do have a dedicated labs team here within AlienVault that's dedicated to doing malware research. We coordinate with around 25 to 30 different organizations, everybody from malware vendors to others in the industry, who allow us to all share threat information. And based off of that threat information, we develop a set of rules that we then feed into the system anywhere from once to twice a week that allow you to provide that frequent contextual update as things are transitioning from one state to another.
I like that because there's so many security appliances are based on signatures. Everyone loves signatures, but what we've always found is that it's better if you get the human element in there because they can tell you whether or not a malware is behaving in the way that you expect it to behave. And rather than a signature, they can actually look at behaviors. So what your solution does is it actually takes behaviors that are seen in the wild, not in a lab, and builds it into the product.
That's right.
Okay,
yeah.
I like
so
that.
All of those threats that you see out there, you can take all of these behaviors, as you put them, and we translate those into a known set of rules that now you can monitor on the wire and on the host behavior. And that behavior can translate into, look, there's this host that's communicating over a particular set of protocols in this particular way, and that's indicative of particular types of threat packages that are used by the bad guys to go do certain things, and that allows us to pretty effectively profile, but not just profile, it kind of takes that need for the security analyst within an organization to have to know all of this information. They have the ability to be able to just use our product to understand that, but at the same time, if they need to understand it, we also provide them that context and information about the threats, about the reputation of those threats and so forth, so they can really get a clear understanding as to what's happening within the environment.
Okay, all right. Now, Cheebert, this is a solution that I could imagine being deployed at a university because you've got a lot of users doing a lot of disparate things who are going to be doing things that don't match signatures really well. We've got Bacon Strip in the chat room who's saying there's just too much data here. The signatures must have signatures. But both of us have seen signatures become relatively useless once you get inside the network, right? So
yeah, a lot of the issues that you see is too many people depend too much on perimeter devices. So yeah, once someone's inside a network, all bets are off. And so one of the weaknesses I've seen in a lot of modern IT structures is it's perimeter only. You know, come on, you know, there needs to be something looking at what's happening inside the network, because that's where a lot of your malware is going to be. You know, it's going to be an infected laptop. It's going to be some kid playing a game in their dad or mom's office, and once they're inside, it's like they're in the castle walls, and they can do anything they want. And yeah, so when I was playing security event managers a long time ago, that was at least a step in the right direction. This sounds like a much better step because yeah, you need correlation. You need to be able to go and look at lots of things, not just the castle walls.
Right. Jim, let me ask you this. Let's take our imaginary network. We've got a 10,000 seat network that we typically use as an example. Let's say we've got AlienVault Unified IEM installed on it. What kind of information would it tell us in a real world network? I mean, when you start talking about contextual security, when you start talking about it's making the correlations for us, what do those correlations look like? So if I'm looking at that single pane of glass, what do you tell me?
Yeah, everything within AlienVault ultimately boils down to a set of basic capability that's provided via what we call alarms. So think of an alarm as, for example, I see here is activity from a very particular type of rootkit, which we see on a system. Now that information related to that rootkit may be something that comes in from that host space IDS, or it could be something that, because of how that other types of malware on that system are communicating outbound, we'll see that type of activity as well. Now, I think as Chee mentioned, you have these signatures internal to the organization, and in a lot of cases, they're not very helpful because you're looking for very specific types of patterns. In AlienVault, we look for the behavior. We look for, well, what does that rootkit usually do when it's talking? And how does it communicate externally to whatever external type entity that it's communicating to? And that's the type of behavior that we look for. So if we see that type of behavior, we can flag that. Now, separately from that, because of the information that's coming in from our open threat exchange, and again, this is that contextual data that our labs guys put together, they evaluate, and they determine, hey, is this thing a real threat that's out there? And what they do is then when you look at this threat or this alarm within the AlienVault console, what you're going to see is the alarm, and then you're going to see whether or not there's something within that OTX reputation database ultimately that is related to that. And if it is, it gets flagged. And that's a really clean indicator of something that you know is known bad, because we've already vetted out a lot of that information related to the attack and the vectors of that attack, rather than just the signature of looking at some kind of random activity on the network.
Right, right. Curtis, do you think that's a possible sell? I mean, again, I'm thinking to your radio program. If you sit down with an executive and you try to explain to him, look, the firewall that we bought is great for external defense. It can look at signatures of attacks, but we need something like this, which does that. Again, AlienVault's open threat exchange is perfect, which actually reaches out into the real world and asks professionals, what are they seeing? And that's why we need to buy this solution. Does that become an easier sell, or does this still sound a little bit like magic?
I don't know that it sounds like magic. Here's where people are going to have their problem. And I've heard this conversation happen. They'll say, okay, you're telling me that I need to protect myself from what might be going on inside my network. If that's where my problem is, then why am I still paying for the firewall? If my firewall is doing the job you told me it was going to do when I had to write the check for it, why do I need this one? The hard part is talking with an executive, someone who doesn't live, breathe, sleep security all the time, talking with them and helping them to understand why both are important. And I think an analogy is probably the best. Just because you have locks on the doors, it doesn't mean you can do away with the security cameras inside the building. And that's really the kind of very basic analogy that you have to make. Yes, you need the firewall. Yes, you need the perimeter security, but it's just not enough. We know from experience that people can and do get in. And when that happens, we need to be able to reach out to this large group of security professionals and respond to what's going on inside the network as quickly as possible to make sure that even if they're roaming the halls, they're not getting into the offices and taking what the company needs to survive.
Jim, I want to give you the last question here, because we do need to wrap it up. We like to give our guests the guru question. And the guru question is always, if you were talking to someone who was looking at setting up, deploying advanced security at their network, what would be the advice you give them? And it doesn't have to be specific to AlienVault, but what would be the things you want them to pay attention to as they're looking at creating something that will protect their network?
Mm-hmm. I think it comes down to what we've talked about already. When you think about how an organization is going to be protected, first off, as we've said, you have to have the basic preventative controls. You have to have your firewall. Without a firewall, you're going to be completely open. It's going to block a lot of the noise. You're going to have some of the other network level security technologies in place to be able to prevent certain types of activity from happening. But at the end of the day, you do have to have a really solid monitoring platform that allows you to really crisply understand the types of activity that are happening. And similar to what we were just talking about, if you're not able to see what's happening past that perimeter and into the depths of the organization and understand it and be able to respond to it, well, you're flying blind. And it's difficult to be able to respond effectively when you don't know what you don't know and what you don't see.
Jim Hansen, Senior Director of Product Management at AlienVault. I want to thank you so very much for coming in. Well, folks, I'm sorry, but we have reached the end of our hour of Enterprise Talk. That's right. You've spent 60+ minutes listening to the best dang enterprise podcast in the world. That's according to 99 out of 100 security signatures. I want to thank my panel for being here, for showing up, for sharing the joy with all of us, starting with my good friend, Brian Chee. Brian, can you tell the folks, well, they'll find you the next week or so?
Well, I'm hoping to try and get more chapters done on my cloud security book. That's the heck for sure. And you know, I'm thinking AlienVault needs a section in that book.
Yes, this would be good, and it gives you material for your book. And also, I believe I've designed a collar that can fit around you so that Twitter can automatically shock you anytime you're not working on the book, just in case you need a little bit of motivation. Okay, there we go. That's the best possible response. Also, my good friend, Curtis Franklin. Curtis, I want to thank you again. You know, when the two of you were gone last week, we had a blast, but it just wasn't the same without my best two buds in the enterprise. Where can the Twilight Riot find you?
Well, Padre, it is great to be back here, even though I did enjoy working on my tan. I'm going to be waiting for my friend Brian to work on the book, because I'm doing my work on it right behind him. And also on Thursday at noon Eastern, I'm going to be doing Network Computing Radio. I've got Randy Bias, CEO and founder of Cloud Scaling. We're going to be talking about making the cloud work for the enterprise. We'd love to have folks come by and join a conversation. And I'm also getting ready. I'm going to be doing live radio every day from Black Hat, coming up in Las Vegas in August. You know, July was just too cool for me. I got to wait till the first week of August to go to Las Vegas. So getting ready for that.
I may actually be joining you for Black Hat and DEF CON, so we might have to do a meetup.
Ooh, looking forward to it.
We could do a meetup over crab.
I'm liking the sound of that.
All right, let's do it.
Dude, you're killing me.
Sorry, well, I mean, literally, because if you ate it, you would die. I know. Well, I've got an EpiPen. Don't worry about it. And also to Jim Hansen, thank you so very much for coming up here. We've been wanting AlienVault since the Heartbleed scandal, and it's nice to finally have you back up. I'm sure we're going to have you on again to talk all about AlienVault, about SIEM, and any advanced security methods. But for the next couple of seconds, could you tell the folks exactly where they can find you, exactly where they can find your company, and exactly where they can find out more about AlienVault?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead and go out to the interwebs, alienvault.com. You can find all about our product, all about our solution, and the approach that we take to security. If you want to reach out to me directly, you've got my Twitter handle, @jhansen2020. Yeah, I appreciate having me on the show, man. This has been great.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. And thanks to you. That's right, the man, the woman, the geek, the gal, the person out there who downloads our show, who watches us live each and every single week. Because if it wasn't for you, well, we wouldn't be able to do Twilight. So I want to do a little something for you. I want to give you a way to get our show automatically on your device of choice. If you go to our show page at twit.tv/Twilight, you'll find a little drop-down menu that will give you all the selections for getting every episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech in the format you want, be it audio, video, high-definition video, onto your iPhone, your iPad, your Android phone or tablet, your Zune, your laptop, your desktop, whatever it may be. If you want it, we'll give it to you. Also, did you know that we actually do this show live? That's right. Every Monday at 2:30 p.m. Pacific, you're going to find us at live.twit.tv. You'll see all of the pre-show, all the post-show, and all of the outtakes, which don't make it into the actual download. So go ahead and join us for a good old time. And as long as you're here, why not jump into the chat room at irc.twit.tv. You'll see me calling out to the chat room quite often because it's filled with some brilliant engineers, with some funny trolls, and all the people who make up the Twit Army. We love you. Finally, I want to thank everyone here in the Brick House who made this show possible, especially to Carson, my super producer, to Lisa and Leo, to Jemmer B, who is my substitute today, and thank you again for tuning in to this episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Until next time, I'm Father Robert Ballecer reminding you that if you want to know what's going on in the enterprise, just keep quiet.